The night the human child should have died began with fire falling from the sky, as burning ships screamed through the clouds and smashed into the dirt like dying beasts. And when the explosions faded, there was nothing left but smoke, broken metal, and the deep, ugly laughter of orcs walking through the ruins, kicking bodies and tearing weapons from dead hands. When suddenly a sound cut through the noise of war, thin and weak, a baby crying inside a crushed transport. And the orcs stopped, confused, because nothing was supposed to cry after a battle like this. And when they ripped open the metal, they found a small human infant still alive, face dirty, eyes wide with terror. And instead of killing it right away, an orc knob squinted at the child and laughed, deciding it would be funny to keep it, not as a pet or a son, but as a thing to see how long it could last. And so the child was dragged back to the camp, where smoke never cleared and violence never slept. And from that first night onward his life became a constant test of pain, hunger, and fear, as he grew among creatures that knew only war, who fed him scraps when they remembered and beat him when they were bored. And the child learned early that crying brought fists, silence brought survival, and weakness meant death, so he learned to crawl away from danger, to hide when fights broke out, and to steal food faster than the smaller orcs could notice. And as years passed, his body grew thin but hard, marked with scars from boots, blades, and whips, while his mind grew sharp because thinking was the only weapon he had. And the orcs called him names in their rough language, mocking his size and soft skin, yet they also noticed that he did not die, no matter how many times they threw him into dangerous tasks, sending him into tunnels filled with beasts, forcing him to run messages through gunfire, or using him as bait during raids, and each time he returned breathing, covered in dirt and blood, learning more about how orcs fought, how they thought, how they laughed when things exploded, and how they grew angry when plans failed, and the human learned their words, their curses, their crude ideas of honor, and he copied their toughness because there was no other choice, even as something inside him remained different because he felt fear before battle, pain after wounds, and doubt when he was alone. Things orcs barely noticed, and at night when the camp quieted just enough he would stare at the stars and feel something missing, a memory he could not fully touch, like a dream slipping away. And sometimes he wondered if there were others like him somewhere, humans who lived without fists and shouting, but those thoughts were dangerous, so he buried them deep, because dreaming made you slow, and slow things died. And as he reached his teenage years, the orcs stopped treating him like a joke and started treating him like a tool, pushing him into fights where speed mattered more than strength, where thinking saved lives faster than muscles, and the human learned to move through chaos like a shadow, ducking under swings, striking weak points, running before the killing blow could land. And some orcs began to laugh less when he passed, watching him with narrow eyes, because orcs respected survival, and surviving this long was strange. And the human felt it too, that strange shift, as if the camp itself had begun to notice him. And then one day everything changed. When a rival warband attacked at dawn, their guns roaring as fires spread through the camp, and in the confusion, the human found himself cut off from the orcs who owned him, trapped between enemies and burning wreckage. And instead of freezing or running blindly, he remembered every fight he had watched, every mistake he had seen orcs make. And he moved with purpose, leading attackers into narrow paths, knocking over fuel barrels, triggering explosions that tore through the enemy ranks. And when the battle ended, the camp still stood, not because of orc strength alone, but because of human planning. And the orcs noticed, standing over the bodies and staring at him with new interest, and whispers spread in their harsh voices, words like cunning and lucky and the biggest orc in the camp. The war boss finally called for the human to be brought before him. And as the human stood there, small before a mountain of green muscle and iron, he felt something colder than fear settle in his chest, because attention from power was never safe. And the war boss looked down at him and grinned, seeing not a child anymore, but something unusual, something useful. And he laughed and declared that the human would fight in the next raid at the front, not as bait, not as a joke, but as part of the war band. And the camp roared with approval, while the human understood the truth hidden beneath the laughter. Because this was not a reward, it was a test, one meant to break him or prove something terrifying. And as the preparations for war began, with guns loaded and engines screaming, the human sharpened his blade in silence, knowing that the next battle would decide whether he was still just a curiosity or something far worse, something that even orcs might one day fear. And as the warband marched toward the next battlefield under a red sky filled with smoke, the human felt the weight of his past pressed down on him. A life stolen, a future unknown, and the grim certainty that surviving among orcs was not victory, but only the beginning of something darker, because in a galaxy that never forgave weakness being raised by monsters, might turn him into one, and the war drums beat louder as the first shots rang out ahead, promising bloodfire and a fate that could no longer be avoided. The second part of his life began the moment the first battle ended and the orcs stopped seeing him as a joke and started seeing him as something useful. After the raid where his quick thinking helped break the enemy lines, the war boss did not forget. In an orc camp, being remembered by power was both an honor and a curse. From that day on, the human was pushed harder than ever, thrown into the front lines of fights where explosions shook the ground and bodies fell like broken tools. While orcs charged forward with roaring guns and blind rage, the human moved differently, watching angles, counting enemies, learning when to strike and when to disappear. This difference saved him again and again, though each survival came with new scars, deeper pain, and heavier exhaustion. The orcs began to give him cruel tasks meant to prove if his earlier success was luck or something more, sending him ahead of the warband to scout enemy positions alone, forcing him to crawl through ruins filled with traps, dead worlds haunted by strange sounds and tunnels where the walls felt alive. Every time he returned with useful information, the orcs laughed loudly and slapped his back hard enough to knock the breath from his lungs, calling him "Da sneaky Humie." Though their words were mocking, there was respect hidden inside them, because orcs valued results above all else. The human learned that knowledge was power, even among monsters. Yet the price was high. As he grew older, the camp grew more dangerous. Rival orcs challenged each other constantly. Fights broke out without warning. And the human learned to read the mood of the camp the way others read the weather, knowing when to stay invisible and when to act bold. He trained his body in secret, running long distances when no one watched, lifting scrap metal to build strength, sharpening his reflexes by dodging thrown objects because speed was his only shield against orc strength. Despite all this, the human felt something inside him pulling in two directions. While his body adapted to war, his mind still remembered fear and loss. At night he dreamed of faces he could not name, voices speaking words softer than orc growls, and he woke with his heart racing, angry at himself for remembering things that made him weak. As years passed, the orcs began to include him in their plans, not openly, but in their own rough way, asking him where enemies might hide, where walls were weakest, and which path would lead to the biggest fight. Each answer he gave brought victory, louder cheers, and more trust, yet also more eyes watching him closely. Orcs did not like things that stood out too much, and whispers spread that the human was strange, that he thought too much, and thinking too much was dangerous. One day, during a massive assault on an Imperial outpost, everything nearly ended when the human hesitated for a single moment. Through the smoke and gunfire, he saw human soldiers fighting and dying, men and women who looked nothing like orcs, whose movements were disciplined, whose fear was hidden behind armor and duty. For a heartbeat he felt connected to them, and that moment of hesitation almost killed him when an orc enemy tackled him from the side, smashing him into the dirt. Only instinct saved him as he rolled away and buried his blade into the orc's neck. After the battle, as the outpost burned and screams echoed across the plains, the human sat alone among the wreckage, shaking, realizing that hesitation was a weakness he could not afford. In this world, mercy was death. The war boss noticed his silence, calling him forward and staring at him with a sharp, curious gaze, asking why he paused in the middle of the fight. The human lied, saying he was waiting for the right moment to strike. The war boss laughed, satisfied with the answer, but the human knew he had crossed an invisible line. From that point on, he pushed his humanity deeper into himself, burying it beneath survival and strategy. The orcs rewarded him with more responsibility, allowing him to lead small groups during raids, watching to see if others would follow a human. To everyone's surprise, they did, because orcs followed strength and success, not blood. Under his direction, fights ended faster and with more loot, and the human felt a strange, cold pride grow inside him. For the first time, he was not just surviving, he was shaping the war around him, and that realization scared him more than any battle. He began to understand that the longer he lived among orcs, the less human he felt, and the more natural war became. When a massive wog began to form engines roaring and banners rising under a blood-red sky, the war boss announced a campaign that would crush entire systems, and he placed the human close to his side not as a slave but as a weapon. As the warband prepared to march, the human looked at the endless army of green botas, guns and steel, and felt the future closing in around him. He knew this path led only deeper into darkness, and yet he stepped forward with the orcs, because turning back was impossible. As the wog moved out, shaking the ground beneath its march, the human realized with grim clarity that he was no longer just a human raised by orcs, but something shaped by them, something the galaxy had never meant to exist, and whatever fate waited ahead would be written in blood, fire, and the choices he could no longer avoid.